Buenos días a todos y todas. Primero recordarles que después de la plática se va a tomar la foto de los 30 años. Entonces, justo después de la plática, ¿perdón? ¿No se oye? Me voy a acercar más. ¿Ahí? Ok. Es que me tengo que agachar mucho. Bien, les decía que les recuerdo que se va a tomar la foto de los 30 años, justo después de la plática. En el patio central, ahí nos vamos a ver en el cerebro de piedra y luego ya se va a tomar la foto. Y bueno, para mí es un placer presentar al doctor Francisco Javier Castellanos. Él es el invitado del Departamento de Neurobiología Conductual y Cognitiva. El doctor nació en Madrid, de padres bolivianos, antes de inmigrar a Estados Unidos a la edad de 9 años. Estudió la lingüística en Vassar College, obtuvo su maestría en psicología experimental en la University of New Orleans y su doctorado en medicina en Louisiana State University en Shreveport, en Los Ángeles. Hizo una residencia combinada en pediatría, psiquiatría general e infanto-juvenil en la Universidad de Kentucky y luego se entrenó en investigación bajo la dirección de la doctora Judith Rapoport en el Instituto Nacional de Salud Mental en IMH, en Bethesda. Después de 10 años en MINH trabajando en la entonces nueva técnica de resonancia magnética estructural, se trasladó en 2001 a Nueva York, donde fundó un grupo de neurociencias pediátricas en la Facultad de Medicina de NYU. Ahí sigue siendo profesor catedrático de psiquiatría infanto-juvenil, radiología y neurociencias. Además, trabaja como investigador en el Nathan Klein Institute for Psychiatry Research y colabora con colegas y ex estudiantes a través del mundo. Sus trabajos publicados han sido citados frecuentemente, resultando como uno de los más citados científicos en el campo de neurociencias en el top 1% según Web of Science. Es un placer tener al doctor Javier Castellanos. Gracias.
Gracias, Eduardo, por la invitación y por traerme aquí a este centro, este instituto tan impresionante. I'm going to speak mostly in English, but I'm happy to take questions in Spanish, and though you'll realize that my Spanish is workable, but not as strong as my English. And so here's the title in English. As we approach the second century of human neuroscience, I'm going to rejoice in that we're in an era of open science. I have no disclosures related to this talk. And briefly, we'll touch on, in a sense, the very roots of using imaging or in vivo studies of the brain, let's say, which can be dated largely, or more or less, to about 100 years ago. And then touch on my own roots in this field, in neuroimaging of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the difficulties that we've encountered as we get more rigorous, the so-called bad news. But then the good news that I think will bring us forward, and that's largely because of the increasing availability of open data. So this is the skull of a famous person who misfortune was a key moment in understanding that brain regions weren't sort of all the same. This is the skull of Phineas Gage, and the reconstruction is that when he was working on that railroad and there was an explosion, it shot this bar of metal through his eye and out of his skull. He survived miraculously, but was different from that point on. And so that was clearly a signal event in terms of understanding that that part of the brain was clearly important in terms of inhibition and decision-making and being a responsible person. Another major event in the 19th century were the studies by Paul Brooke and colleagues noticing that individuals who had had impairments in their ability to speak when they died had clear damage to parts of the brain in the left anterior frontal lobe, the Broca's area, as it's now known. And for many years, understanding brain function was really dependent on brain lesions. And in fact, that phenomenon was so ubiquitous that we didn't have a review on the structure and function of the precuneus until 2006, because the precuneus is never lost in strokes. It's the most active part of the brain, and it's the most vascular. And so it was, in a sense, we were blind to its centrality by its very centrality. However, I'm focusing on in vivo studies of the brain, and it turns out that it's a bit more than 100 years ago that Walter Dandy used the new technique of radiography and the innovation of evacuating the cerebral spinal fluid through a lumbar puncture to be able to obtain radiographies of the lateral ventricles. And that technique, which started being used in 1919, was in use for half a century after that. It was still used clinically until the 1970s, because it was really the only way to detect whether or not there was a tumor that was pushing on the ventricles or some other kind of lesion. We were blind to the brain until post-mortem. Of course, that changed, but then the event that I think all of us will celebrate starting next year was the application of the new technique of electroencephalography by Hans Berger in 1924. In a paper published in 1928, this was the first EEG recording, which was taken from a child. And the top tracing is the EEG, and the bottom tracing is a 10 hertz frequency reference. So this is the famous alpha rhythm. We can deduce that the child had his eyes closed. So we'll jump from this through the next 50 years to the availability of magnetic resonance imaging, which is now ubiquitous. And as you well know, I arrived at NIMH for my postdoctoral training in 1991, and it was 6 months after the installation of the 1.5 Tesla scanners from GE that were the workhorses for so-called high-resolution imaging at the time. The previous generation of scanners had about a third of that in terms of field strength, and the best you could do was get slices of about 5 to 7 millimeters, which was, again, a big improvement over doing pneumoencephalography, but did not give the resolution needed to quantify brain structure. And it wasn't my plan to get into this field, but I happened to be working for Judy Rappaport and alongside Jay Geed, and we started to study some of the children that were in the studies that I was involved in on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And these kids would come into our program for up to 3 months, and they would go to school every day, and we would give them medications. I was doing lumbar punctures, again, to get cerebral spinal fluid. To study them, we were doing blood collections and urine collections and giving them double-blind medications. And so Judy Rappaport's suggestion was, they're here anyways, let's ask them and their parents if they'd mind having an MRI scan. And so that's how we started to do this, very tentatively, but in a very crude way. We used a paper that had been published by Sandra Whittleson just a few years before that, where she had suggested that studying the corpus callosum post-mortem, it made sense to cut it or cleave it along the planes that you see on the right. And so Jay very reasonably thought, let's use that, apply that to the mid-sagittal corpus callosum and see if we find differences. To my surprise and our delight, we found and detected some small statistically significant differences despite the super small sample size. This was very much a pilot study, but it encourages us to keep going. And so over a decade, we accumulated about 300 children, half with ADHD and roughly half who were comparisons from the community, including about a third who'd never taken a medication. And by then, we were beginning to do longitudinal scanning, which is hugely important. Again, after about a decade's work, I was able to distill this into a paper which we published in JAMA, which really established that there are brain structural differences, that they're not secondary to medications, which was a big question mark. But again, the techniques were very crude. So the best we could do was get whole brain and brain lobe measurements and differentiate white and gray. But that was the state of the art at around the turn of the century. Now, of course, technology is always increasing and improving. And so the field has progressed dramatically. So now that it's been possible to harness data obtained from multiple centers throughout the world, and one of the major efforts in doing so is called ENIGMA, which stands for Enhancing Neuroimaging Genetics Through Meta-Analyses. This was first motivated by the idea of linking genetic data, where you need large samples, to structural phenotypes. But it's also been gone way beyond that, to just being able to bring data sets from brain imaging across a whole series of conditions. And one of those has certainly been ADHD, in work that's been led by Martijn Hoogman and colleagues in the Netherlands. Back in 2017, we published the first paper with almost, I'm going to say about 1,700 individuals with ADHD and roughly the same number of controls, obtained from laboratories throughout the world. All of the data were examined using the same version of FreeSurfer, and so it became tractable to combine the FreeSurfer results, even if we weren't sharing the raw data, which in many cases was problematic because it hadn't been consented appropriately to be able to do that, et cetera. So that's been the big innovation of ENIGMA, is being able to share the statistical derivatives or the measurements, the indices, without having to worry about the confidentiality and privacy of individual participants. So what that study definitively showed is that, again, there are structural brain differences, but I'll show you that, effect sizes, I won't ask you to look at the individuals, but I'll show that, again, in a study that was updated by increasing samples and centers, and also now looking at surface area and brain thickness, the same results hold up, which is that the overall size of the brain, if you measure through intracranial volume, is significantly smaller in individuals with ADHD, in children. But the effect size is 1/10 of a standard deviation, a Cohen's d of 0.1. So that's the real effect size, or is the best estimate we have of the real effect size. And it's a very humbling one, because it really suggests that even with 300 individuals, we were moderately powered to detect something like that. And certainly most studies are not adequately powered to detect that, because it's hard to get a sample of more than 100. Now, having taken into account the overall differences, again, there are subcortical differences between patients and controls in the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, caudate, hippocampus, and putamen. But for reasons that we still don't understand, these results only hold up in children. In adolescents, we only see a difference in the hippocampus. And none of these survive in adults with ADHD, despite their meeting criteria for ADHD. So again, that's one of the puzzles in the field, that we don't understand whether this relates to developmental differences, because these are cross-sectional studies. So it will take years before we really understand whether or not this is what it's due to and if it's a real effect. The second part of this study that was published more recently in 2019, as I said, looked at surface area. And it turns out that that has a slightly larger effect size. That's 2/10 of a standard deviation. And there are a few areas that, again, go beyond that in terms of differentiating individuals with ADHD and controls. But again, in children, the caudal middle frontal gyrus, the orbital frontal cortex, that Phineas Gage region, middle temporal, rostral anterior and posterior cingulate, and superior frontal. All of those decreased with effect sizes between 0.1 and 0.2 standard deviations. And much more variable effects in adolescents, which were not significant, and no differences between adults with and without ADHD. This is all structural imaging data, but obviously functional imaging is also of interest, and a number of studies have been done. In 2019, colleagues including Samuele Cortese and Simon and Claudia Eickhoff published an analysis which synthesized 96 studies, structural and functional. They were trying to be as inclusive as possible. They included 1,900 unique participants, and at the end of the day, there were no differences. And that was an important result, disappointing as it was. So that's the bad news, in a sense, in the field that I've dedicated my career to. That there are some real replicable differences, but they're subtle. And they hold up best in brain structure, and I think that's because that's a highly reliable measure. Reliability is hugely important because it sets the upper limit on validity. There's a very easy to remember formula. The maximum validity is equal to the square root of the reliability. And so reliability is rarely greater than 0.8. Well, in terms of structural imaging, it's in the high 0.9s. I've seen 0.99 in some cases. So that's one of the good news, is that the technology is really improved so that the same person scanned twice or scanned on two different scanners will often give you very similar values. Then all the other things that we measure for function, diffusion, etc., have much lower kinds of reliabilities. So that really makes it harder to detect real differences. And the biggest problem has been small sample size. MRI, as wonderful as it is, as ubiquitous as it is still often expensive, hard to get. It's not easy to stay in a scanner for 30, 40, 60 minutes. And so we have to publish, otherwise we can't keep doing this work, but we tend to publish papers with low statistical power, and that tells us that we have very low likelihood of finding real effects and a high likelihood of publishing erroneous results, type 1 errors, especially given how many ways you can analyze the data. And I think, consciously and subconsciously, we all have some element of p-hacking, which is to keep going until we find something that's significant. In a field that I've been even more dedicated to, resting state functional imaging, the oscillating brain, Edmund Sanuga-Bark and I formulated the fault mode interference hypothesis in 2007. He twisted my arm because I didn't think we were ready to do so. But it's turned out that that's a very attractive way of thinking about the way in which these intrinsic functional oscillations may be interfering with and or affecting behavior and cognition. My colleagues at the Nathan Klein Institute are involved in a major study to examine this sort of thing in much more detail in humans and in non-human primates. So over the next 5 years, we will be able to examine this with in vivo electrocorticography in both humans and rhesus macaques, as well as studies with using a whole range of multimodal approaches. But in the meantime, we've been publishing on this as a field, and an analysis that we did a couple of years ago, pooling, starting with 4,400 possible papers, we identified 18 studies that used whole brain seed-based functional connectivity so that we could really compare the same kinds of studies. Almost 1,000 participants in those, and again, nothing held up. This awareness of difficulties was really first explosively brought into the field's sort of consciousness in 2015, 2016. 2015 was when this paper was first posted on bioRxiv, and everyone started saying, it can't be true, this is not possible. But cluster failure is a pun on a more crude way of discussing problems. And the awareness that the field, both through a software error in AFNI and through choosing techniques that would seem to give results, we're really working with type 1 error rates that were as high as 50, 60%, and had been doing so for many, many years. So that was, again, a great awakening. After a while, we've come to terms with that. But here's where I want to make a provocative suggestion. I think that as a field, we were, to use a phrase used by a former chairman of the Federal Reserve, like business people, we were irrationally exuberant about the likelihood that MRI was going to lead to strong, actionable results. But in my, again, very amateurish reading of history, I think that that theme comes through repeatedly. So Christopher Columbus, for example, knew the world was round, but his best estimate was that it was 8,000 miles in circumference. And so he had set out on a voyage that should take about 3 or 4 months, and that's how much food and supplies he had. And he was off by a factor of 3. Luckily, they ran into Hispaniola just before he was about to be, deposed as captain of the Santa Maria, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it was the overestimate or the over-optimism that allowed him to assert that this would be a great opportunity for the Spanish kings to be able to profit from this easier, quicker route to the Indies. The Human Genome Project, which has been a major achievement in science, was really made possible by the extremely forceful and vigorous advocacy of Jim Watson, who went to Congress and really twisted people's arms. And I heard him speak once and acknowledge that his motivation had been personal. His son has severe schizophrenia, he told us, and he was convinced that that was the only hope of coming up with a treatment that might be curative or that might make a real difference. Of course, it hasn't worked out quite so cleanly and neatly, but without that, passion, we might still be thinking about how to do this with technologies that would not have been accelerated as much as they were by the efforts that he kind of catalyzed. And it was interesting now, Oppenheimer has been in the theaters, and they don't mention this in the movie, but in his biography, which I read a few years ago, it's noted that there were errors of calculation in how much uranium it would take to make the atom bomb. And so the British physicists who worked this out thought it would take 1/10 as much as it really turned out to be. And Heisenberg, who was doing the same work for the Nazis, actually made the error in the opposite direction, that he thought it would take 10 times as much. And so they did not pursue an atom bomb, which we were worried they were going to, because they thought it would be too difficult. And whereas once the Manhattan Project people sort of arrived in Los Alamos, they worked out the numbers and realized, oh God, we need 10 times more uranium. Well, we're all here. There's no turning back. And so they just made 10 times more uranium. So my thesis is that if we really knew how hard it is to do this, we wouldn't start. And so I think we have to kid ourselves oftentimes and convince ourselves that it's just around the corner. At least that's what I've been doing for years and years now. And that we do advance, and then we realize, it's a longer trip than I thought, but we've already started, so let's keep going. So I think that that's where we are. In fact, it's been shown that effect sizes always start off dramatic, because that's how you get published, is with a big, strong effect size. And as other people start to look at that, they start to do better and more rigorous studies, and effect sizes always shrink down to either they disappear, or if they're real, they go to the 0.1, 0.2, maybe if you're really lucky, 0.3 Cohen effect sizes. So that's what's happening in our field. That's what's happened. It's why we realized that in many cases we need to do this through large-scale consortia, where data collection is funded separately from the analysis process. And most of those, at least those that are being supported by the National Institutes of Health in the US, are absolutely explicitly designed as open science efforts. Now, the fields of science, and this may be the case for many of you here, have benefited from this for a long time. So I first heard about this from Corey Bargman, who is one of the major figures in the C. elegans community. And she pointed out that the Drosophila or fruit fly scientists and C. elegans scientists all emerged from a single lab. They basically were all kind of, intellectual great-grandchildren of one person. And so, in a sense, they're all intellectually related. And so they've built communities in which everybody is really connected, and the culture is you let people know as soon as you find something, and as soon as you have a new reagent, you make people aware that they can use it. And so it's a culture of sharing and cooperation, which has been dramatically helpful in terms of accelerating their rates of progress. So the C. elegans, the worm, was the first organism in which the entire connectome was mapped, right? Even though it's a relatively small community, but because they were working together, they were able to accelerate their progress. And so I heard her speak about that, and I thought that made so much sense. And I think that that's been one of my major contributions, is that I then inculcated that sort of desire in my colleagues. Now, we weren't not the first to promote open data sharing. In fact, colleagues at Washington University, who were among the leaders in pursuing resting state imaging, had set this up before. And we investigated it, and like others, realized this is a lot of work. And so, in fact, that never took off. And so when we were confronted by a lot of skepticism in the field. And so Morcom and Fletcher in 2007, for example, wrote a commentary in Neuroimage in which they basically said, the title was "Time to Give Rest a Rest." And the gist was, back in the early days when we didn't have any sophistication, we had to use rest as a clear condition, but now task is what we should all be using. And I totally respect task-based imaging, but it's difficult to do in infants or animals or children with different cognitive capabilities or different ages. It was really too much of a challenge for me. And so I felt we had to find other ways to do this if we were going to look at brain function. And resting state seemed to provide an opportunity. At the time, I had moved from NIH to NYU. I had a small group, and nobody knew who we were. And Bharat Biswal, who discovered this phenomenon of functional connectivity back in 1995, is the nicest, most humble guy you'll ever meet. And he does not promote himself at all. And so nobody knew him. Nobody knew his work. And it basically had disappeared from view until Marcus Raichle coined the brain's default mode and identified that there was a network that was observable on PET that seemed to relate to this alternation in attention between internal and external states. It's a longer story, and I won't go into all the details of it, but WashU became sort of the center of activity in this, and as I said, we certainly were not a major player. And so we strategized a little bit about this, and we decided to, we were starting to do this and published a couple of papers, but again, we're not getting much notice. So, and we had lots of skepticism. A lot of people were saying this is just pure artifact. And so we decided, let's make the data public. And we then started inviting people to make their data public. And, some were reluctant, but others we basically used social pressure and said, you know, so-and-so at MGH is giving us data. Why don't you want to be a part of this as well? And by leveraging relationships, we had no funding for it, and by making it easy. So if someone said, you know, I've got data and you could get it, but I don't know how to get it to you, and you know, again, this was not when we could just easily stream things and send them through FTPs, you know, sites, etc. So we would send them hard drives and say, put it on your hard drive and send it to us. And at the time, I was well funded, and so we had a lot of postdocs. The most diligent of whom was Martin Menes, and we called him the Belgian workhorse. And he just ground out taking all these data and curating it, cleaning it, checking that it was in the right orientation, occasionally missed some. And that was one of the concerns. What if we put mistakes out there? Well, what happens is people find it, and then they would, you know, notify us, and then we would fix it, and then put up a notice that say, by the way, you know, this is now fixed. The most important thing was we made it easy to access the data because they were anonymized, and all we knew was the site, age, and sex. And so with that, anyone who was interested could literally just download the tarball. And it turned out that no one was paying attention, and then Nora Volkov, who's still a very active investigator and director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, was sick with the flu that year. She said she hadn't taken a vaccine, and so she wasn't able to work for a week, but she wasn't catching up on bad television or reading a novel. Instead, she downloaded our data on her laptop on her couch, and within a week, she and Dardo Tomasi had written a paper showing that his new method of analyzing functional connectivity worked in these uncurated data sets obtained from all over the world on 1.5 and 3 Tesla magnets, that there was a true uniformity to the kind of functional structure of intrinsic functional activity in the brain. And that turned her around and really helped to change the stance at NIH, which at the time was only task-based fMRI is important and resting state is an artifact. So she was a key player. We published our paper in February of 2010. Hers was published in May of 2010. She was that fast. But that led to then people noticing the paper, and as of this week, it's been cited more than 3,000 times. Bharat Biswal went from being someone that nobody knew to now being acknowledged as the person who first detected this phenomenon back in 1995. And I've put the links there, and Eduardo will have all these slides if you're all are interested in sort of finding these links, but you can easily access these data yourself and see, you know, play with them if you're interested. After this, we thought, what do we do next? And so most of this work, I had the idea, but Mike Millam has really made all of this work ever since. And he decided to launch the ADHD 200 project. The goal was to have 200 cases of kids with ADHD and 200 controls, and then have a held back data set and challenge the field to identify the diagnoses on those for whom the labels were not provided, as a way of recruiting biostatisticians and machine language experts and biomedical engineers and others to focus on you know, a backwater problem as far as the world is concerned, the structure of function of the brain in children with ADHD. We ourselves were working on a paper describing this sample, and that's part of the reward for those who contribute data, is that they get to be part of the announcement paper, which is usually a highly cited paper, and in fact had to revise and resubmit at PNAS when Jonathan Power at WashU and colleagues realized that even small amounts of head movement were extremely prone to produce artifacts that could be misread as age-related differences in functional connectivity, and children are more likely to move than adults. Hyperactive children are more likely to move than non-hyperactive children. And so it took us, and mostly Damien Fair and his colleagues who were taking the lead on this paper, more than a year to really confirm the results in a low-motion subgroup of the data. We withdrew the paper from PNAS and eventually published it in Frontiers. But we learned the lesson of, again, the importance of head motion in the field. So we thought, what's next? And we decided to tackle autism, another hugely problematic and highly heterogeneous condition. This was work that has been passionately led by Adriana Di Martino, who was at the time a postdoctoral fellow and then faculty in my group. And we created the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange, or ABIDE. She was on a K Award, which is a mentored research training award at the time, and so her 75% of her salary was supported, so that, in a sense, is how this was supported. She worked tirelessly to recruit data from colleagues around the world, and again, we harnessed our colleagues in the lab to put it into shape. That was able to then be used as the basis for a separate grant, a small grant from NIH, an R21 mechanism, to expand this into what was called ABIDE 2. Since its first release in 2012, they've been able to aggregate more than 2,000 MRI data sets, which include age and phenotypic data from 24 international sites. And this is from a presentation that was, or a poster that was presented at OHBM, and is in the process of being turned into a systematic review and meta-analysis. But basically, as of the end of 2022, there were 633 papers that have been published with data from this repository of ABIDE. This shows the growth of publication rates over the decade, and primary purposes of the study, differentiating individuals with autism from those without autism. One of the fears that people have is that publishing papers with secondary data or from a data resource like this will not be able to be suitable for high-impact journals. The median impact factor across these 600 plus papers is 5. One of them is 69. But as you can see, there are a number of papers with high impact factors that have been made from this. And again, most of them have to do with primary analyses, but about 10% with replication of results that are obtained locally, and then ABIDE is used in order to confirm that these samples and these results replicate. The effect of ABIDE has been to increase sample size dramatically in the field, and so these are the distributions for both the autistic children in gray and the controls in the blue, typically developing children. And so there's a hump of the 30 to 50, but there's also 300 to 400 per group, which is where you start to get good statistical power. Still too few females, but certainly more able to do studies with females because of being able to aggregate them across these 24 different centers, and a range of ages. And Adriana reminded me to say that Mexico is not currently represented in ABIDE, and so she asked me to let you all know that if you know anyone who's scanning children with autism and comparisons, that you should let her know, because she'll do everything possible to facilitate your inclusion. So in the field of autism imaging, ABIDE has really transformed it. Statistical power has been dramatically increased, particularly for resting state imaging, but also structural imaging. And the good news is that after several attempts, because it takes multiple tries to get grants from NIH typically, Adriana and colleagues have finally been funded to do the next sort of mega version of this, which will also extract data from the NIMH data archive. which is a repository where all of us who are funded by NIMH are now required to make our data available. And so that is going to dramatically increase the amount of available data. And I wanted to make this a part of the presentation in order to, again, proselytize for the accessibility and availability of these data resources. All the Human Connectome Project data sets are archived at NDA. These go from the baby connectome project to lifespan and HCP development. The Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, ABCD, massive study, is accessible through NDA. And HBCD is about to be launched, and it will cover the first decade of life. So ABCD covers the second decade from age 9 to age 20. The current available data is from up to age 14. This is the longitudinal study of 11,700 kids being followed with prospective data, and it's going to massively transform our awareness of adolescence. And HBCD is likely to do the same thing for infants through the first decade of life, with a focus on parents with mothers with substance use reports or demographic risks for that. So half the sample is designed to have those either mothers who report using substances or have demographic risk factors for that, and the other half to be comparators who are not with those risks. Again, these are large, gigantic, extremely expensive efforts, but they will transform the study of development. And so those of us who care about that need to know about that. In the meantime, my colleagues and I at the Nathan Klein Institute in New York created the Rockland sample a number of years ago, and here's the announcement paper for that. This was a lifespan sample going from ages 6 through 85. These are the age distributions. And here's the phenotyping, which again you cannot see, but that's why I said that Eduardo will have all these slides, and actually you can access all of these online. But I wanted to let you know about the second generation of this, again after many attempts. This has just been funded by NIH. We're calling it the NKI Rockland Sample 2. It's headed by Mike Millam and Stan Colcomb. And in order to get a grant, you have to be able to have specific scientific aims, but really this is a data collection study. And so this was just good enough to make it through the reviewers, to use brain age prediction as a derivative that we can then use against this broad range of phenotypic factors. But the real heart of this is multimodal MRI, EEG, and other physiologic indices. Again, a vast array of phenotypic measures, and many of these collected through MindLogger, which is a phone-based app that can be easily downloaded and customized. And also the physiologic measures are being set up to take advantage of Scott McKeague's mobile brain imaging lab, which is described in this paper, and allows all of these measures, whether it's eye gaze and pupil diameter, eye tracking, brain dynamics, respiration, raw EEG, etc., to be placed into the same analytic framework, a non-trivial factor. Again, everything from respiratory belt, EKG, like dermal activity, I don't think we're doing EMG actually, but pupillometry, EEG, all of that's done outside the magnet, and then as much of that as possible is done inside the magnet as well. A small subset has EEG inside the magnet. And so these data, again, will include and are including, because this is already underway, a vast array of cognitive tasks. And again, an example of some of these tasks on this MindLogger platform include things like a spiral, where the individual needs to trace and follow the spiral, the Ray Osterheis complex figure, etc. Even handwriting tasks can be set up And so, again, all of these data are available. Drawing tasks can be done on a tablet. And all of this is downloadable if you're interested. And you can access this and write papers and do analyses and compare them to your own data sets. This data set includes passive movie viewing with, I think, The Present is one and Sherlock is the other. And these films have been segmented so that you can then use those as parameters for your analyses, because you can tell that this was a scene cut or this was an emotional moment, or all of that data are available. And you have data from, again, many individuals who've undergone this. Ecological sampling is a part of this, being done in collaboration with Kathleen Marikangas and her colleagues at NIMH. And this allows people to be asked multiple times a day if they agree, how they're feeling, how they slept. Then they get this feedback, which again goes into the data repository of sleep, activity, mood, affect. Actigraphy is a part of this. And finally, multimodal imaging, multiband, multi-echo fMRI, DKAI for diffusion imaging, and navigator-guided structural images to decrease motion effects for T1 and T2, arterial spin labeling to get perfusion, T2 star to look at iron levels, which there's interesting preliminary data suggesting that that's a key parameter for many interesting areas of psychopathology. And finally, neuromelanin, which gives us an indication of brain dopamine. So how do you get the data? Start here, the International Neuroimaging Data Sharing Initiative on NITRIC. And let me go back for a second. And again, it's as straightforward as clicking, and then that will take you to different sites where there are data that you can download because it's anonymized and it's low dimensionality in a sense. It's just brain structure and function, which is the 1,000 functional connectomes. In most cases, you're going to be interested in the high dimensionality data, which is so rich that you can identify someone with, Facebook or Instagram and those data sets, because you can really pin down who they are because you know so much about their family structure, et cetera. And so those data sets are protected by the application of data use agreements. So you have to get your institution to vouch that you will respect the principles of ethical conduct of research, and that if you don't, your institution will discipline you. And so with those protections in place, you have access to this vast amount of data. There's more data than we'll ever be able to write. And so again, that's part of the motivation, is that when we collect these data sets with so much effort, if we write, we always write one paper because otherwise you can't get another grant. But if we write 2 or 3 papers from one data set, that's a rich harvest. And you could write 1,000 papers from any one of these data sets. And so by making them available, they're able to become useful for multiple applications, many of which we hadn't thought about. Another colleague is Chaogan Yan, who spent 4 years in the lab and is now Director of Functional Imaging at the Institute of Psychology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And he's been focused on depression, another highly heterogeneous condition. Again, a Babel's tower of results that don't seem to make sense. And so he's created the DIRECT Consortium and the REST Meta MDD project. I'm just going to fly through this because I'm sure we're running out of time. But part of what Chaogan has dedicated himself to is making it easy for individuals to do complex brain imaging studies, because he wants clinicians, physicians who are involved in collecting data to be able to analyze it. And so he's made it as simple as possible. He calls this platform DPABI, and it's become a highly cited work. And again, here's some of the accolades for it, including from the inventor of BOLD imaging. This is a group that includes data collected exclusively at this point from China, but is made available in terms of the derivatives, again, to investigators around the world. And the fMRI MAPS project makes it possible to get the non-thresholded statistical maps, which again can be shared without worries about confidentiality. This has become a rich source of publications already. Again, these data are available through open access. Some of this is, first of all, it's impossible to read, but some of it is in Chinese characters. But I want you to be aware of that for those who may be interested. And again, here's the announcement paper that provided that information. Chao Gan is the most collaborative person around, and so he really means that, and he teaches and has courses online where you can learn how to use these techniques. Now, this is moving my clicker. So, to sort of partly summarize this, sharing data is just something we all should be doing whenever possible. First of all, it reassures reviewers and readers that you're not hiding anything. And it greatly facilitates replication and extension of your work, which is the whole point of publishing. But it also helps your citations and your H-index, because people are more likely to notice it, and they have to cite your paper if they're going to use your data. Now, it's important to obtain consent for data sharing, and ideally that's done before you collect the data, and it's also important to get ethics committees to look over your shoulder to make sure that you're not being overly enthusiastic in this process. Some data can be easily anonymized, which means nobody knows which data set went with which ID. You break the key. That's only the way, that's how anonymized data is defined. If you still know who's who, then that's de-identified data, and frequently that's the way. It's important because the data are so complex. But in those cases, it's usually important to use data use agreements in order to protect the confidentiality of the participants. It's just super easy to figure out who someone is, and this would die if someone is identified and said, oh, by the way, I noticed your data on such and such, do you want to tell me about it? That would be a huge scandal, and so our data sharing world is kind of dependent on our respecting people's privacy and confidentiality. I want to mention that one of those who's shared his data is Eduardo Garza Villarreal. We had discussions about this as we were writing this paper, and Eduardo went and got individuals to consent after the data were collected, if I remember correctly, to be able to then upload their data and make it available to the field. And independently, Chao Gan realized that that was there, and so I'm a co-author on a paper where Chao Gan is using Eduardo's data as part of, and also part of the direct MDD data to advance the field of transcranial magnetic stimulation. And so again, that's how this becomes a synergistic process. And one of the final things I want to let you know about is, again, there's a profusion of open data. I just yesterday was approved to access the Databrary, which is a video data library for behavioral scientists, which has been established by Karen Adolph and colleagues at New York University. And it has, again, video, which is, how identifiable is that? That's that unique baby. But this is on their public website, a child for whom there's consent to show this. But when you are approved and you are an institution that has a federal-wide assurance, which says that you will follow the ethical principles of research, then you can have access to rich data sets, and you can also upload your own data sets so that the field will benefit from those and make collaborations easier. Finally, a lot of this work has been led, as I said, by Mike Millam and colleagues at the Child Mind Institute. Mike created the International Neuroimaging Data Sharing Initiative, or INDI, and that's a one-stop click to access all of these. And I'll just mention in super passing the primate data exchange, which is the place to go if you're interested in the macaque anatomy and functional brain imaging increasingly. And so, again, this is part of our landscape. I haven't even mentioned AI. I'm not competent to get into that, but It obviously depends on open data. And the combination of the exploding capabilities of artificial intelligence and multimodal open data are going to, I think, really lead to a quantum leap in our ability to detect the fundamental principles underlying the complexity of the brain. The brain is incredibly complex. That's a trivial statement. And yet, complexity has within it simple principles. And my favorite example of this is the periodic table of the elements, which took a community decades to put together, but it led to the understanding of fundamental commonalities between halides or the salts, the metals, etc. Such power that once that structure became known, you could predict that there had to be an element that would fit in this space. And in fact, all of those spaces have been filled. That predictive power is what we're lacking and what we need. And so understanding what the principles are, we know some of the elements. We talk about inflammatory processes. We talk about pruning and differentiation of neurons and all of those things. But really, we need these rich data sets in order to understand what are the principles that are going to allow us to really understand how the brain works when it works well and when it doesn't work so well. So using the motto of the group that Martin Menes came up with, share that brain. And with that, I'll say thank you and take questions. And I will remind you that there are microphones on either side. And if you can't reach there, I'll do my best to repeat what you've said. But I'd love comments, questions, or arguments. Hi.
Hi. Thanks a lot for being here and for your talk. Okay. I have two topics that I'd like to hear your insights on. One is the different approaches in getting data that was already there from small cohorts or relatively big cohorts to turn them into something big, with the caveat that some piece of information that you really wanted might not be there, which happens a lot, for example, in Enigma. Versus the approach of prospectively looking for a lot of information, which the caveat is cost. What are your thoughts on these two options?
Well, I think you've put it very succinctly that they're both have costs and benefits. One, prospective data collection, you pay a lot to make sure that there's harmonization. It takes time, more than a year usually, to hammer out all the selections of what data are going to be collected, and then a huge amount of work goes into curating to make sure that the uniformity is maintained. And so that's the nature of Human Connectome Project kinds of efforts where millions of dollars go into doing this right. And so I think that that's terrific. It's an interesting issue, and it's one that Mike, for example, addressed in getting the Rockland sample refunded, which was that in a sense, those are like battleships. They move slowly. There are committees of hundreds of people, and you can't do highly innovative things because not everybody can do that. So for example, ABCD is a magnificent data set. On the other hand, in part because of the need to use the lowest common denominator for the functional imaging, the functional imaging, task-based imaging is not so strong. They themselves published a paper showing that effect sizes are pitiful. And it's just, a very messy data with motion, et cetera. They declined to use multi-echo methods, which would have helped dramatically with that, but would have been difficult to put into all of the sites on the timeline that they had. And so that's, again, when you have the prospective harmonization, you have a kind of lowest common denominator of what everyone can do. And so the smaller sites that are trying to push the envelope can be more aggressive. The kind of multimodal harnessing of multiple measures would be impossible to do on a large scale until you've done it once and then see what can be deployed across other sites. So it's never either or. It's both have value, and understanding what you can pull from one versus the other. Abide, for example, is all previously collected data. And so it has, some data sets include, rigorous autism phenotyping with ADOS and ADIRs and IQ testing. Others just have a diagnosis. This is a healthy control and this is a child with autism. And so it's incumbent on the investigator who's using those data sets to decide, how am I going to weigh those factors and to look at the data and to see, how much is sample size enough of an improvement over the potential difficulties. But that's the art of this. That's what makes this, so that it's what when we take data from others, what we invest in, and the reviewers will respond to, and then, through that process is the alchemy, because this is truly the alchemy of science, right? That we take data and from that make knowledge. So I think both of those approaches work, and with increasing, ability to use technical tools and harness, technology. For example, there's a colleague of Mike's that uses, I forget what they call it. It's like Grindr, but it's where you're able to get people to look at brain images and swipe right or swipe left, depending on whether it's good quality or not. And so you can train undergraduates rapidly to do this, and then you can get multiple people to rate the same images, and so you can do rapid curating of data sets by getting people to make this into a game. And so gamification of this, again, accelerates this process. And so you can have value added to data sets that may not have had those things built in.
Thanks. I had another question, but I'll let somebody else.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. I would love to learn from you. What's your opinion about the increased diagnosis of ADHD? At least in my experience here in Mexico, it's like everyone's kids had some sort of ADHD or neurodiversity. Like it's like the new fashion, and I want to know your opinion whether if that's how that will impact in the certainty of if it was underdiagnosed previously, which I suppose because that's like these kind of disorders are really new in the public. But what's your opinion on that?
Oof. Ask an easy question. So let me say that one of the posters that I saw just a little while ago, Eduardo, it's your group, is it Cesar? Mm-hmm. Looking at diet? No. Whose poster was that? Diet and epigenetics. Yeah. Showing that cafeteria diet, which is what we eat, given to the dams, has influence on the third generation, in this case in terms of an anxiety phenotype. Incontrovertible. I mean, this is not, rats sort of imagining that they're being anxious. This is hard data on terms of laboratory measures that are related to an anxiety phenotype happening in the third generation. So we're all participants in an uncontrolled experiment of what happens when we deprive ourselves of sleep, when we look at screens for far too long, and when we eat poorly. Some of us will be relatively resistant to that, but others not. And I think that that's happening increasingly. There are other factors across the world. The age of being parents increases. It takes longer to sort of feel like you're ready to have a child, etc. And that plays into sort of genetic diversity in terms of single nucleotide changes in the DNA. So all of those factors make me not simply ignore secular increases. In the States, you've asked about ADHD, but neurodiversity or autism spectrum is now about 2%. We started at 1 in 10,000, when I was in training 30 years ago. It's a spectrum, so it includes a lot of people who are functioning well in many ways, but quirky or odd. But it's not always just so simple, right? There's a lot of unhappiness and anguish that are also part of that. But to come back to your question about ADHD, it's hugely challenging because it's so much in the eye of the beholder. We do not know what it is. It's part of what I've hoped that my work would lead to, and it's not yet there in terms of understanding the physiology and being better able to create diagnostic algorithms. At this point, we're dependent on a checklist and on, parental and teacher feedback, which replicate about 0.3. So 90% of the variance is unshared in those situations. And it's a mess, frankly. Where I come down on that, and it's been many years since I was a clinician, but when I was, for me, the real question is, how is this child functioning? And if they're creating friendships, if they're learning, if they're doing well in the family, in the school, in the community, I don't care if they're hyperactive. That's trivial, irrelevant. But often, the quiet kids who space out, or the kids who are rambunctious, then become more and more troublemaking and get a reputation for that, and then externalize and experiment with substances and go into that path. So we know, and my study was the first to show, that being hyperactive in childhood is lethal. There's a higher mortality rate. It's been replicated now multiple times in larger data sets. But we had a longitudinal study that went from ages 7 to age 41. And we found triple the number of deaths and double the number of non-medical deaths, even within a relatively small sample. So there are huge difficulties to this phenotype that have to be taken seriously and have to be looked at from that lens of how is this individual functioning. Now, we live in a society where everyone is so stressed that parents literally give their infants their phone to be able to have a little bit of time, for themselves. And these things are incredibly easy for an infant to work with and to then be sucked into. And we know, Dr. Harmony will tell you, that that's not the way the brain was designed to work, that that's not a good way of learning to be attentive to your environment. That's a way to get sucked into a very one-dimensional way of relating to the world. And so we are experiencing, I think, a life in which we're challenging ourselves and our children to thrive despite these challenges. And companies are making huge amounts of money off of getting us hooked to our screens. And they pay the legislators to support their campaigns so that they get to write the rules. It's going to be very difficult to change this, but that's part of what I think is undergirding some of this. Now, again, it comes back to the other question of, is some of it being overdone? Yeah, I'm certain it is, because we don't really know, what's going on in some cases. But I still see too many kids and hear of too many kids for whom that hasn't been raised as a problem. If it's a girl, or if they're quiet, they're frequently ignored until they've decided, I'm stupid, I can't do this, I'm going to drop out of this educational process because it's not for me. So diagnosis is always a challenge. It's never perfect, but you try to balance the over and the under as best you can, and be humble about it is my only recommendation. Yes?
Yes, thank you. This is a question that arrived by the YouTube channel. It's from Rafael Sandoval. It says, if Phineas Gage were a Stone-Age man or even someone from Middle-Age Europe, would it still be valid for contemporary psychiatry to abstract all the lessons he did from his brain injury?
So I think the question really raises, again, questions of cultural context. Phineas Gage was by reputation a hardworking railroad man, and after his accident and survival, no longer was. And so his activities were remarked by his colleagues who went, oh, you used to be such a good guy and now you're a mess. But in a different context, had he survived, I don't know that he'd been working on a railroad if he was prehistoric, but that he survived something like that. There might be a different profile in terms of the dysfunction that relates to that. So again, context is hugely a part of this. 100 years ago, we didn't expect or require children to sit in classrooms for multiple hours a day to accumulate the information that we require now to be able to be competent in such a technologically challenging environment. It's often of interest to me that the best psychometric tests we have measure intelligence, right? IQ tests. And yet they have to be re-standardized every half a generation or so, every 15 years or so. They have to be made more difficult in order to have the mean remain at 100. So you have to be smarter now to just stay even. So, all of us, if we went back to the time of Phineas Gage, would be geniuses. So it's in our context that we have to measure these things. And so that's my only sort of remark to that comment.
Thank you. And there is a second question. This is from Alejandra Lopez. Could it be enriching to elaborate translational hypotheses that together with neuroimaging databases from behavioral experiments in other animals, not just humans, also be shared?
I didn't quite hear that we can use data from other animals and not just humans.
Exactly.
Should be shared, absolutely. Yes. So that's why I mentioned PRIME-DE, which is the primate data exchange. But there are, I don't know the names of data sharing approaches in rodents. I don't know how advanced they are. But certainly in the C. elegans and the Drosophila community, they're extremely open communities. Again, culture comes into play and how things get started. So I think in rodent work, there's more of a, us and them and competition and all of that, which is part of why I was sort of pleased to be among the early days of resting state, and we could get that culture going, that we share everything because no one believes us anyways. And so that helped us to kind of reinforce that ethos. But I think increasingly it's going to be a requirement. If you're funded by NIH and you're doing rat work, you've got to make it available. And so that's going to be, data that have to be provided. But as I mentioned, Charlie Schroeder and Mike Millam are, I didn't give their names, but they're leading this grant, this center grant, looking at the importance of slow fluctuations in brain function for cognition and behavior, and are doing so in humans, both invasively and non-invasively, as well as in rhesus macaques, invasively and non-invasively. So macaques with indwelling electrodes in whom these things can be measured very precisely, and also they can have fMRI studies and imaging studies, and all those data sets will be made public as part of this. Everything we do, we make public.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You mentioned that effect sizes in MRI research seem to be small, but if this is so, then how can MRI research be useful for clinical purposes or psychiatry?
That's the problem, that's the challenge. First of all, MRI as a clinical tool is not a clinical tool at this point. It breaks my heart to say that, okay? 30 years of work and we don't help the clinical process because of that, because the effect sizes are so small. We don't have results on a single individual that can tell us do this or do that. We have probabilistic results. We say this group of people is going to do better than those, but we're not yet there. It could be starting to change, but what MRI is used for now is to see if you have a gross lesion or a gross abnormality. So it's the clinical read of a radiologist that says, this is abnormal or normal, and it's a very wide range. I've seen my brain many times because I've had many scans, and I think my corpus callosum is very abnormal, but it's never been remarked on by the radiologists because it gets very thin in a couple places. My genome is okay, my splenum is great, but my mid-corpus callosum almost disappears, which I think explains why I'm so poorly coordinated, but that's a different story. That's not a clinical read. So that's the point, is that we cannot use an MRI to diagnose ADHD or autism or any of these methods yet, any of these diagnoses yet. Now, where it's starting to change, and Eduardo is a part of this work, is that using neuromodulation methods of stimulating the brain, whether it's with transcranial methods or electrical or ultrasound, various approaches are being tested. The transcranial magnetic stimulation is the most advanced. Location is key, and knowing where to stimulate makes a huge difference. And so that work has been advancing slowly. What's been approved by the FDA is to literally find the motor, the part of the brain that makes your thumbs and finger twitch, and then move 5 centimeters anterior of that, and that's where you stimulate for treating of depression. That's the state of the art. It's really shaky. 5 centimeters in front of your motor is not the same for everybody in terms of where you go. So Mike Fox and his colleagues at Harvard use imaging data from 1,000 healthy volunteers in order to get the locations of the brain networks that you're hoping to try to be able to access in order to stimulate the appropriate parts of the brain. And that effect is that improves things. But that's still averaging things over 1,000 people. And so where the field needs to go, and I think is now possible, is to get to single subject measurements where it takes sometimes several hours of scanning But you can get enough data that you can then get precise estimates of each individual's circuitry and where their default network is, where their frontal parietal control network or salience network, etc., and then use that information to target regions. That's the plan, that's the hypothesis, that hasn't yet been done. But using Eduardo's data, which he put the brain images and the results of TMS in individuals with cocaine addiction, but also measured their depression, Chao Gan Yan, who I've mentioned, is working on using that information in order to detect where the best places to stimulate are for depression. And so that will be tested. And then Mendy Mejia at Indiana, his method for using what she calls template independent component analysis in order to get into single subject space, which again is where we need to move in order to make this clinically relevant. So these methods are bubbling up, and I hope that by being aware of this work coming from multiple places, the community will be able to cross-link them and to accelerate this process, because it's been very, it's a long process, and we haven't yet, made the payoff or achieved the payoff.
No more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Entonces ya podríamos ir a la foto. Gracias.